Alright, so today I want to do a head-to-head comparison of a white ball python compared to a black ball python. And if you've been watching my videos here on YouTube, you know we're normally talking about the genetics of ball pythons, which genes we can mix together in the parents to combine and make some really amazing combinations in the hatchlings when we're breeding ball pythons. But today I want to switch gears and talk about pet ball pythons. And pretty much you can make a pet out of any snake. For example, this snake I have around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. He is an 8-year-old male, pretty much just a pet at this point. He was one of my very original breeders for bamboos here in my collection, but it's just kind of retired as a pet. And there's certain genes and certain combinations that are more geared towards the pet industry. And I'd say probably the 3 most popular pets that I've actually seen working with ball pythons, probably the #1 most popular is the normal ball python. You know, most of the times I'll go to a reptile show and I'll be selling ball pythons at my table, and I'll have like a table of 60 hatchlings, and the first ones that go are the normals. And it's because it's pretty much the least expensive ball pythons. And people are just looking to get into the hobby just to kind of have a pet snake, maybe just one snake, not really thinking about breeding it. And normally they'll actually get just the normal classic wild type as their first snake. And I've also noticed that 2 other ones that are really popular as pets is the completely white ball python and the completely black ball python. And let me tell you, there's the pros and cons for each one. When you're actually comparing them side by side, there's some things you should definitely look for when deciding if you want a white ball python or a black one. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you how to make some of these white and black ball pythons and some of the pros and cons of each, and help you decide which one to choose, either a white one or a black one. Alright, so I want to jump over here on Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with the black snakes. And believe it or not, I've had quite a few people over the last year say, hey, I'm looking for a pet snake. I want one that is completely patternless and as jet black as possible. What are the genes I should be looking for when I'm looking for my black snake? And let me tell you, when it comes to black snakes compared to white snakes, there's probably just a handful of ways that you can actually make a completely black and patternless ball python compared to all the different ways you can make a white snake. There's probably dozens and dozens of ways to make the white snake versus the black snake. And pretty much the darkest, blackest snake that I've actually seen in all of ball pythons is this one right here. This is actually the super black pastel with 2 copies of the black pastel gene. And it's kind of interesting with the black pastel because it's one of the more variable genes. It's extremely variable from one example of the black pastel to the other. So if you actually come over here on Morph Market and look at the super black pastels, they can really vary from all the way to like an almost light brown snake all the way to the extreme end where you have a completely jet black snake. I'd say when most people think of the super black pastel, they're really not thinking about this really super jet black ball python, which is kind of the exception, but it's kind of the darkest snake that I've actually seen as far as the darkest jet black snake over here in Morph Market. And there's another one that's really similar to the super black pastel, and that is the super cinnamon. And look at how dark this one is. And the cinnamon is really similar to the black pastel. It can be extremely variable, and I'd say the super cinnamon in most cases it's actually kind of a brown snake or even a light brown snake in a lot of cases, but you can actually get super cinnamons on the extreme end where you can actually get a really super jet black snake, which is pretty amazing. And believe it or not, the cinnamon and the black pastel are allelic. So if you take a cinnamon, breed it to a black pastel, 25% of the time you'll actually get an 8 ball. And take a look at this. This is another extremely dark version of the 8 ball, and the 8 balls can be really variable too from one example of the 8 ball to the other. And kind of the interesting thing with the cinnamon and the black pastel is they tend to have genetic defects, especially with the super cinnamon and the super black pastel. I'd say probably one of the more common genetic defects that you'll find is kind of an irregular head shape on a lot of your supers, the super cinnamon and the super black pastel. A lot of times it'll have, I've actually seen a lot of them where the nose is kind of shortened. It almost looks like a pug nose, and some people don't like it, and I think it's kind of cute on some of these, the super cinnamons and the super black pastels. I've actually seen in a lot of cases where they'll actually have kind of a flattened out nose. Some people call it duck billing, where it's a little bit flatter in the mouth area where it kind of broadens out in the mouth. Sometimes you get some really irregular head shapes. And then also with the super black pastel and the super cinnamon, they say sometimes you'll actually have some kinking in the spine where you'll have a genetic defect where the spine can't completely straighten out. Although I've heard reports of a lot of people saying that they kink, but I haven't actually seen a lot of them over here in Morphmarket where people will say this actually has a kink in the spine. So I'm not sure how common the kinking is with those two, but I've actually heard that if you actually take the black pastel and mix it with the cinnamon to make the 8-ball, this snake right here, it tends to reduce the occurrence of the genetic defects. You get less duck billing and a kind of a normal head shape and less kinking of the spine when you actually make the 8-ball. And some people are trying to kind of get around the whole kinking and the duck billing, kind of the genetic defects, and what they're actually going with is the Suma, which is the super mahogany. So take a look at this. This is another really dark snake, and the interesting thing, if you actually look at all the supers, the super mahoganies over here on Morphmarket, I say pretty much across the board, they're all really dark snakes. And if you actually look at like the super cinnamons, I say in most cases, the super cinnamons are kind of like brown snakes, or sometimes even like a light brown, where you have one, every now and then you'll actually have an exception with the super black pastel or the super cinnamon that's really dark. But the Sumas, pretty much all the time you'll actually get a really dark snake like this. Not quite as dark as the extreme examples of the super black pastel or the super cinnamon. And the other thing with the Suma is if you actually look at the mahogany, the one copy of the mahogany just by itself, a lot of times it'll have kind of a copperish color to the mahogany. If you actually have two copies of the mahogany to make the Suma, a lot of times it'll actually bring a little bit of that coppery color in with your black snake. And a lot of the Sumas will actually have this line right down the top. Sometimes it'll be almost like a copper colored line right down the top of the snake. So I've actually seen some people, you know, trying to take the Suma and make them even darker. And one way to make the Suma even darker is to add either one copy of the cinnamon or the black pastel to the super mahogany. So take a look at this. This is a pretty amazing combination. I'd say this is pretty much your ideal black snake of all the black snakes. This is actually a cinnamon Suma. So keep in mind with the cinnamon and the black pastel, usually you only get the genetic defects if you make the supers with two copies of the gene. And in this case, with just one copy of the cinnamon, you don't really get the genetic defects. And then layer that on top of the super mahogany, which doesn't have any genetic defects. This is probably the best and darkest black snake that I've ever seen, with pretty much zero risk of genetic defects as far as I've heard over here. This is a pretty amazing snake. So here's another black snake. This is actually the super blackhead. And when you're actually thinking about the dark genes, I'd say the blackhead is probably the darkest of all the dark snakes. When you just take one copy of the blackhead and you work it in with other combinations, it can really darken a lot of your combinations. But the kind of the interesting thing with the blackhead is if you have two copies of the gene to make the super, you still get a lot of pattern in the snake. It has a really super dark background, but it's not completely patternless. So this could possibly be one of your darkest snakes, like on the top of the head, that really super dark. But if it wasn't for the pattern, this would probably be one of your darkest combinations. All right, so let's shift gears over to the white snakes. There's quite a few different ways to make a white snake. Probably the most popular is the blue-eyed leucistic, which is the all-white snake with the blue eyes. And what that is, it actually consists of two genes in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and there's quite a few ways you can actually make one. So this one actually consists of the lesser and the Mojave. Both genes are in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, so you can actually have like a super lesser, you can have a super Mojave, you can have like a lesser bamboo, like the snake that's around my neck at the beginning of the end of the videos. That is Bobby, and he is in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you actually have bamboo and lesser, you'll also get a white snake. There's like, I think I did a video on white snakes. There's like, I think there was like, we came up with like 43 different ways to make a white snake, which is pretty amazing. And this one right here is pretty much the ideal white snake with the lesser and the Mojave. It's kind of interesting. if you have a lot of genes in the blue-eyed leucistic coming together, sometimes you'll actually get a little bit of pattern and color coming through the snake where you can actually see it's not a really super bright white snake like this. Sometimes with the Mojave, if you mix it with certain genes, you get like purplish colored snake, like with the Purple Passion or the Mystic Potion, which is kind of interesting. They're considered to be blue-eyed leucistics, but they're kind of a purplish colored snake with some pattern coming through. And the other thing with the blue-eyed leucistic is sometimes with certain genes coming together, you can actually get kind of like a genetic anomaly with the eye size on a lot of your combinations. So for example, if you actually made a super lesser with 2 copies of the lesser gene, it tends to have what they call bug eyes, like really big, like almost alien looking eyes in some cases, where they're just like bulging out of the head. And some people absolutely love the bug eyes, and some people kind of steer clear of them. As a matter of fact, with certain ones, you can actually have micro eyes, really super tiny eyes. And it seems like if you actually mix the lesser and the Mojave, that's the ideal combination where you get the ideal size of the eye and you get the brightest white snake that is, in most cases, it's a really super bright white. And I've actually seen in some lesser Mojaves, you have a little bit of yellow coming right down the top, but in a lot of cases, you'll get a really stark white snake, which is pretty awesome. So here's another way you can actually make a white snake, and that is with the ivory. The ivory is a super yellow belly with 2 copies of the yellow belly. And usually your ivories aren't as white as your blue-eyed leucistics in most cases. Sometimes they can be almost like, kind of like a dirty white snake. I've actually seen some where it almost looks like they rolled around in ashes or something. You kind of have some gray on the side of the snake. Sometimes, I'd say in most ivories, you'll actually have some kind of like a gray, kind of like a color on top of the head, and sometimes you'll actually have this kind of the yellow stripe right down the top of the ivories. But I have seen some ivories that are completely white, almost I'd say pretty much as white as the lesser Mojave blue-eyed leucistic, which sometimes the ivories can be pretty variable. And here is one more that is pretty much the brightest white snake that you can actually get, and that is a pied with other genes to completely reduce all the pattern of the pied. So the pied actually usually has like big splotches of pattern through the snake, and with certain genes mixed with the pied, you can really reduce it, or in times you can actually completely eliminate all the pattern and end up with a completely white snake. And there's nothing that can really break through the white of a pied. It is really super bright white, probably your brightest white. The only bummer about the pieds is it doesn't really have the really bright blue eyes that you'd see in your blue-eyed leucistic. So this one is actually a pinto pied, which is the combination of the Russo and the pied. The Russo is in the blue-eyed leucistic, but when you mix it in with pied, most of the times it'll give you a really extremely high white pied, and in a few cases you'll actually reduce it to a completely white pied with no color at all. You can actually do the same thing with spider. Sometimes spider will actually reduce it and give you a white wedding, which is a spider pied that is completely white. So there's quite a few ways you can make a white one, a lot more ways you can make a white ball python versus a black one. So if you were to actually compare the white one versus the black one, which one to choose? I would say pretty much out of all the black ones, what I would actually go for is this one right here. I would go for the Cinnamon Suma. This is pretty much your ideal completely black patternless snake, super dark snake. That is pretty awesome. If you actually went with your ideal white snake, pretty much the best one that I would go for is this one right here. This is the combination of the lesser and the Mojave, a really bright white snake with bright blue eyes. Sometimes the eyes can be even bluer than this. I've seen some really incredibly bright eyes on some of these blue-eyed leucistics. So if I actually had to choose between the white and the black for my next pet snake, probably my first impulse would be this one. This is the Cinnamon Suma, because, you know, number one, it's not quite as popular as some of the white snakes. So if you actually had something like this, you could wow a lot of people. People are like, oh man, that is like the most amazing snake, because it's really unlike anything you've ever seen. And the other kind of the downside with with this snake, if you're actually comparing this one to the ideal blue-eyed leucistic, it really comes down to the price. That is the deal breaker on this one. So it's kind of interesting. If you actually have a Summa, which is the super mahogany, it's not really that popular. You know, the Summa is not as popular as a lot of the other jeans, and sometimes if you have something that's really amazing and not really that popular, the prices can be astronomical. So this one actually sold for $2,500, which is kind of crazy. And if you actually compare that to this one, the blue-eyed leucistics are a lot more reasonable. This one's actually sold for $650. Then you have $55 shipping, so about $700. I've actually seen these blue-eyed leucistics, you know, less than that. As a matter of fact, they've really increased in price over the last few years, which is pretty amazing. It seemed like just a couple years ago, they were all like $300 or $400, and now they've come up all the way to like $600 to $700, which is pretty amazing. So, you know, a lot of people, it's kind of interesting. I've actually produced quite a few blue-eyed leucistics at some of the reptile shows, and the problem is when I produce a blue-eyed leucistic, it's the combination usually of my bamboo and the lesser. And let me tell you, the bamboo gene just by itself can be really expensive, and then when you mix it in with the blue-eyed leucistic, it can be even more expensive than your average blue-eyed leucistic. So kind of the thing that I ran into at some of the reptile shows is I'd be selling these white snakes with the blue eyes, and my prices at my table would be several $100s more than the white snake with blue eyes at the tables next to me in the same reptile show. And everyone would come up to me showing me all these blue-eyed leucistics that they bought, and they weren't buying my snake. And it's because most people, when they're buying the white snake, they're actually buying it as a pet versus a breeder and breeding that into other combinations to produce like more bamboos and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting what people are looking at, especially with the white snakes, the blue-eyed leucistics. It seems like I'd say probably 90% of all the ones that I've seen that people have sold are sold as pets instead of breeders. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Danny asks, what should I breed to my lesser Mojave blue-eyed leucistic? I want to make some more blue-eyed leucistics, but I also want some snakes that are not all white ball pythons. And that is a very good question. So keep in mind, if you actually take a blue-eyed leucistic, you breed it to another blue-eyed leucistic, all the offspring would be all white blue-eyed leucistics. So what you really want is you want to take that and breed it to something that just has one gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And there's quite a few options that you can actually choose from when you're picking a snake with a particular gene. And what I would actually do is I would use the Mojave as one of the genes to breed that to. So if you actually make the Super Mojave is an all-white snake with kind of a grayed out head, versus if you actually make a lesser Mojave, which doesn't have the grayed out head. So you can actually make blue-eyed leucistics, and you could actually tell the difference between your lesser Mojaves and your Super Mojaves, which would be pretty powerful. So for example, if you actually took that snake and bred it to Bobby, the bamboo I have around my neck here, this is a bamboo ball python, which is also in the blue-eyed leucistic. You'd make lesser bamboos and bamboo Mojaves, and I'm not sure you could actually tell the difference between those two snakes. You'd have to actually sell them as blue-eyed leucistics, possible lesser or Mojave when you're selling those things. I've actually seen some people where they actually take two blue-eyed leucistics with completely different genes and breed them together and just sell snakes as blue-eyed leucistics. And when people buy them, they're buying them as pets, and they don't really care about the genes in them. As a matter of fact, a lot of people are wondering what the genes are in their blue-eyed leucistics, because you have all these genes from the parents that kind of get blurred together. And I think it would be pretty powerful to know exactly what the genes are in the offspring that you're selling when you're selling your blue-eyed leucistics. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.